3 men stood in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded, not by 10 men, not by 50, but by an army. Hundreds of soldiers were closing in on them. The sound of footsteps, armor, and weapons filled the air. There was no backup, no reinforcements, no way out. If this were real life, this is where the story would end. But it didn't, because the Bible says they fought, and somehow they won. One of them killed hundreds in a single battle. Another fought so long that his hand locked to his sword. And the third stood alone in a field and refused to move. This doesn't make sense. This isn't strategy. This isn't normal human behavior. So the real question is, what kind of men don't run when running is the only way to survive? Because the answer is more disturbing than most people realize. You might not see this channel again, so do well to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Are you in the United States like myself, or somewhere else in the world? Let me know in the comments section below. In ancient warfare, there was one rule everyone understood. If you are outnumbered, you die. Not maybe, not sometimes, you die. There were no advanced weapons, no modern protection, no second chances. Battles were brutal, direct, and unforgiving, which is exactly why this story is so difficult to explain. Because these men kept winning, even when they were outnumbered, even when survival should have been impossible. And once you start to really think about that, you begin to realize this isn't just history, it's something deeper. The first man had a name. His name was Jashobeam, also known as Josheb-Basshebeth. A name most people have never heard, a name most people would skip past without thinking twice. But what he did is not something you forget. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just another man in David's army. He was the leader of David's elite warriors, the kind of man other warriors looked at and immediately understood. This one is different. And then the Bible records something that almost sounds like an exaggeration, something that makes you pause and wonder, is this literal? It says, he killed 800 men in a single battle. 800. Let that sit for a moment. Not over a week, not across multiple battles, not with an army behind him. In one encounter, 800 men against one. Now stop. Don't rush past that number, because most people hear it and move on too quickly. So let's slow it down. Imagine it, a battlefield, not clean, not organized, dust rising into the air, so thick it's hard to see clearly. The smell of sweat, metal, blood, voices shouting, feet stomping, weapons clashing. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos is one man, Jashobeam. He's not hidden, he's not protected, he's surrounded. Enemies in front of him, behind him, to his left, to his right. Weapons raised, eyes locked on him, and every single one of them knows the same thing. This man should not survive, because in their world, numbers decide everything, and the numbers are not in his favor, not even close. So what does a normal person do in that moment? They run, they retreat, they look for an opening, they try to survive. But Jashobeam did something different. He stepped forward. Think about that. Not backward, not sideways, forward, toward the danger, toward the pressure, toward the place where survival becomes least likely. And then he fought, not carefully, not cautiously, violently. One strike, another, then another. Movement after movement. No hesitation, no pause. Just action. The kind of action that doesn't come from comfort. It comes from something deeper. Because at some point, something changes inside a person. There's a moment where fear should take over. A moment where the body says, this is too much. You can't survive this. But instead of shutting down, something else takes control. Fear begins to fade. See, not because the situation is safe, but because the mind has shifted. The instinct to survive gets replaced by something stronger: focus, clarity, intensity. And when that happens, a human being becomes extremely difficult to stop, because now they're no longer reacting, they're fully engaged. Every movement is intentional, every strike is precise. There's no wasted energy, no hesitation, no second guessing, just forward motion. And the more pressure builds, the sharper they become. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because this kind of behavior is not normal. This is not how most people operate. Most people break under pressure. Most people fold when things get overwhelming. Most people retreat when survival is threatened. But this man didn't. So, which raises a question most people don't ask. What did he believe in that moment? Because belief changes behavior. If you believe you're going to lose, you fight differently. If you believe you're going to die, you hesitate. But if something inside you removes that fear, everything changes. Now imagine the scene again. The battlefield is still chaotic, but something is different. Men are falling, one after another, not because of numbers, but because of one man. And slowly, something shifts in the atmosphere. The same soldiers who rushed forward with confidence begin to hesitate, because now they're seeing something they didn't expect. Resistance, relentlessness, a man who refuses to stop. And when people see that, it does something to them. It introduces doubt, and doubt is dangerous in a fight. All because once doubt enters the mind, confidence begins to collapse. And when confidence collapses, so does coordination. And when that happens, the numbers no longer matter as much as they used to. Now it's not just a battle of strength, it's a battle of mindset. And in that moment, Jashobeam had the advantage, not because he had more men, but because he had something most of them didn't. Control. Control over his fear. Control over his focus. Control over his response. And that control allowed him to do something that should not have been possible. He kept going until the battlefield looked different, until the numbers no longer worked against him, until the impossible became reality. 800 men, one man standing. What? And when you hear that, you have to ask yourself something. Not just, how did he do it? But something deeper. What would it take for a person to reach that level? Because this story isn't just about what happened. It's about what a human being becomes when fear loses its grip. And once you understand that, you start to realize something. This wasn't just a battle. This was a glimpse of what's possible when limits begin to disappear. And this was only the first man. Because the second man might be even more disturbing. The second man was called Eleazar, the son of Dodo, and his story is different. Not louder, not bigger, but somehow more intense, because this one is about what happens when a man is left completely alone. No backup, no support, no one beside him, just silence and the sound of people running away. Because that's how this moment begins. The battlefield was already in motion. The tension was already there. The enemy was already advancing. And then something happened. The men around him ran. Not slowly, not strategically. They turned, and they left, one after another, until the noise of footsteps faded into the distance. And suddenly, everything changed, because now it wasn't a group. It was one man, Eleazar, standing alone. Imagine that moment. The dust is still in the air. The noise of battle hasn't disappeared, but the people who were supposed to stand with you are gone. And now every eye is on you. The enemy sees it. They notice, because they understand something immediately. He's alone. And in war, that changes everything, because when someone is alone, they become a target, an opportunity, an easy victory. So what does a normal person do in that moment? They follow the others. They run. They try to survive. But Eleazar didn't move. He stood his ground, not because it was easy, not because it made sense, but because something inside him refused to retreat. And that's where this story changes, because standing alone is one of the hardest things a person can do. Not physically, mentally, emotionally. Because when you're alone, there's no one to share the pressure, no one to help you carry the fear, no one to remind you that you're not the only one. It's just you, and whatever is coming toward you. And what was coming toward Eleazar was not small. The Bible says, a group of Philistines came against him. Not one man, not two, a group, an advancing force, weapons ready, moving towards someone they believed would be easy to defeat. But they were wrong, because Eleazar did not break. The fighting began, not carefully, not slowly, but suddenly. One enemy, then another, wave after wave, closing in. And still, he kept going, strike after strike, movement after movement, no pause, no hesitation, just action. Because once a fight like this begins, there's no space for doubt, no time to think, no room for hesitation. You either engage fully or you collapse. And Eleazar chose to engage, fully, completely, relentlessly. But here's the part that doesn't make sense, because his body should have failed. At some point, his strength should have given out, his breathing should have become too heavy, his arms should have slowed down, his focus should have faded. That's what happens to normal people. That's what happens when the body reaches its limit. But it didn't happen. Not here. Because something unusual took place. Something that goes beyond explanation. The Bible describes it in a way that almost sounds unreal. It says, his hand locked to his sword. Not as a figure of speech, not as symbolism, but physically. His hand refused to let go. Think about that. He fought for so long and with so much intensity, with so much force, that his body stopped releasing the weapon. It held on, as if it had decided, we're not done yet. What kind of state does a person enter when pain no longer matters, when exhaustion no longer stops them, when the body goes beyond what it was designed to do? Because at that point, you're no longer just fighting. You've crossed into something deeper, a place where instinct changes, where focus sharpens, where everything unnecessary disappears, and all that remains is action, pure, undivided, relentless action. Now imagine the battlefield again. The same enemies who approached with confidence are now facing something unexpected. Resistance, consistency, a man who does not slow down, a man who does not retreat, a man who does not stop. And slowly, something begins to shift, because just like confidence spreads, fear does too. And now, the fear is not in Eleazar, it's in them, because they're seeing something that doesn't behave like a normal man. And when that happens, their advantage begins to disappear. Because numbers only matter when the people using them believe they will win. But once that belief starts to crack, everything changes. And in that moment, Eleazar had something they didn't. Control. Control over his mind, control over his fear, control over his response. And that control allowed him to do something that should not have been possible. He kept going, until the group that came against him was no longer advancing, until the pressure that surrounded him began to collapse, until the battlefield looked different, until the impossible became real. He stood alone and defeated an entire group of Philistines. One man, no support, no retreat, no surrender, just presence, just endurance, just refusal. And when you hear that, you have to ask yourself something. Not just, how did he survive, but something deeper. What kind of person refuses to break when everything says they should? because that's what this moment reveals. Not just strength, but capacity, the ability to carry pressure without collapsing, the ability to stay when leaving would be easier, the ability to continue when stopping would make sense. And that kind of capacity is rare, but when it exists, it changes outcomes, it changes situations, it changes what is possible. And this was only the second man. Because the third man did something even more personal. The third man had a name. His name was Shammah, the son of Agi, and his battle might be the most personal of them all. Because, unlike the others, this wasn't just about survival. This wasn't just about combat. This wasn't just about facing an enemy. This was about something smaller, something most people would overlook, something most people would walk away from. A field, a simple, ordinary field of lentils. No gold, no treasure, no throne, just crops, just land, just something that, on the surface, didn't seem worth dying for. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. Because when the enemy came, everyone else made the same decision. They ran. Not because they were weak, not because they were cowards, but because, logically, it made sense. Why risk your life for a field? Why stand your ground when you can walk away and live? Why fight when retreat is the safer option? So they left, one by one, until the field was empty, except for one man, Shammah. Imagine that moment, the wind moving across the field, the sound of distant movement, and then you see them, an entire troop of Philistines, advancing, not slowly, not cautiously, confident, because from their perspective, this was easy. No resistance, no opposition, just land waiting to be taken. And then they notice something. One man, standing, not hiding, not running, standing in the middle of the field. And now everything changes, because suddenly, this isn't just a takeover, it's a confrontation. And now all attention is focused on him, Shammah, one man against an advancing force. And this is the moment that defines everything, because in that moment, he had a choice, the same choice everyone else made. Leave, walk away, survive. And no one would blame him. No one would question him. No one would expect anything different. But he didn't leave. He stayed. And in that moment, he made a decision. A quiet decision. Not announced, not dramatic, but powerful. If they wanted that field, they would have to go through him. Think about that. Not a speech, not a declaration, just a decision. And sometimes, that's all it takes, because decisions define outcomes. And the moment you decide to stand, everything changes. The fear is still there. The danger is still real. The odds are still against you, but your position is no longer negotiable. You're not leaving, and once that becomes real, something shifts inside you. Because now, you're not reacting anymore. You're committed, and commitment is a powerful force. Because it removes options, it removes hesitation, it removes escape. Now there's only one direction, forward. And that's exactly what happened. The battle began, not between two armies, but between one man and a group, an entire troop of Philistines. The Bible doesn't tell us the number, and maybe that's intentional, because the number isn't the focus, the situation is. Overwhelming odds, impossible positioning, a man who should not win, and yet he fought, not for glory, not for recognition, but for something simple, something personal, something that mattered to him. And this is where the story becomes real, because everyone has a field, something in their life that may not look important to others, but matters to them. their family, their purpose, their values, their ground. And there comes a moment in life where something challenges that. Pressure, people, situations, and in that moment, you have the same choice. Walk away or stand. And most people walk away because it's easier, because it's safer, because it makes sense. But Shammah didn't. He stood against overwhelming odds, against logic, against fear, and somehow they couldn't take the field. Let that sink in. An entire troop came against one man, and they failed, not because the odds were in his favor, but because something inside him was stronger than the pressure around him. And that's what most people miss. This wasn't just a fight. This was identity. This was a man deciding, this is mine, and I'm not moving. And when someone reaches that point, they become incredibly difficult to move. Because now, they're not fighting for survival. They're fighting for meaning, and meaning is stronger than fear. Meaning is stronger than logic. Meaning is stronger than pressure. And when a person connects to that, something changes. They hold their ground, they endure, they resist, until the situation begins to shift, until the pressure starts to break, until the thing that came against them realizes something. This is not going to be easy, and sometimes that realization alone is enough to change the outcome. Shammah stood, and he didn't move, and because he didn't move, the field remained his. One man, one field, one decision, and everything changed. And when you hear that, you have to ask yourself something. Not just, why did he fight? But something deeper. What is your field? And when the moment comes, will you stand? Or will you walk away? Because what happens next reveals something even deeper about these men. 3 different men, 3 different battles, and 3 impossible victories. But here's the detail that most people overlook. The Bible never says they won because they were strong. Up to this point, everything you've heard can still be explained away. Skill, training, experience. You could say, maybe they were just elite warriors. Maybe they were stronger. Maybe they were faster. Maybe they were more disciplined. And for a moment, that explanation feels comfortable because it keeps everything within human limits. It keeps the story logical, predictable, safe. But then, the Bible says something very specific, something most people read and move past too quickly. It says, the Lord brought about a great victory. Not them, God. And in that moment, everything changes. Because if that statement is true, then we've been looking at this story the wrong way. This is no longer just about 3 men fighting against impossible odds. This is about something else entirely. Something unseen. Something that doesn't show up on the battlefield, but changes everything happening on it. Because if God brought the victory, then these men were not fighting alone. Which means there was another presence there. Not visible, not measurable, but active, involved, engaged. And if that's true, then the numbers don't matter the way we think they do, because now it's not just 3 men versus an army. It's something more, something that shifts the balance in ways we don't fully understand. And that's where this story becomes uncomfortable. Because most people don't know what to do with that idea. We understand strength. We understand strategy. We understand skill. But something unseen, something that influences outcomes without being visible, that challenges everything. Because it forces a new question. Not just, how did they win? But something deeper. What happens when a person is not fighting alone? Think about that, because in every battle we've looked at, there's a pattern. Jashobim, outnumbered. Eleazar, abandoned. Shammah, standing alone. Situations where defeat should have been guaranteed. And yet, the outcome was different. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because something else entered the equation. And the Bible gives it a name: the Lord. Now, this is where people usually split. Some hear this and dismiss it. They say, it's symbolic, it's poetic, it's just how people explained things back then. And that's one way to see it. But there's another possibility, a possibility that is harder to ignore. What if it's literal? What if these men actually believed they were not alone? And what if that belief changed the way they fought? Because belief is powerful. It changes behavior, it changes perception, it changes response. If you believe you're alone, you fight one way. If you believe help is coming, you fight another way. But if you believe that something greater is with you, something shifts completely. Fear begins to lose its grip, hesitation starts to disappear, and decisions become clearer, because now you're not relying only on yourself, and that changes everything. But here's the part most people don't think about. These men didn't just experience victory, they expected something. They moved like they already believed. The outcome was different, not guaranteed by logic, but grounded in something deeper: faith. And faith is not just belief, it's alignment. It's a way of seeing the world that changes how you act inside it. Because when faith becomes real, it doesn't remove pressure, it changes how you respond to it. Jashobeam didn't see 800 men. Eleazar didn't see abandonment. Shammah didn't see a lost field. They saw something else, something that allowed them to stand when others ran. Something that allowed them to continue when others stopped. Something that allowed them to win when they should have lost. And that something was not visible. Now imagine this for a moment. Same battlefield, same enemies, same situation. But remove that belief. Remove that sense of presence. Remove that connection. What happens? Everything changes. Because now, it's just a man against overwhelming odds. And in that scenario, the outcome is predictable: defeat. But that's not what happened, because something was different. And the Bible doesn't hide it. It tells you directly. The Lord brought about a great victory. Which means the real story is not about what these men did. It's about who they were aligned with. And that's where this becomes personal. Because this isn't just about ancient battles. It's about a pattern that still exists. In life, people face situations that feel overwhelming. Pressure, responsibility, moments where everything feels stacked against them. And in those moments, there are usually two responses. One, based on fear. The other, based on something deeper. And the difference between those two responses can completely change the outcome. Because if you truly believe, you are not alone. You stand differently. You move differently. You decide differently. And sometimes, that difference is enough. Enough to hold your ground. Enough to endure. Enough to push through something that would normally break you. And that's what we're seeing here. Not just strength, not just skill, but alignment, presence, and a belief that shifted reality. So maybe the real question is not just how they fought, but what they believed while they were fighting. Because if that belief was real, then the battlefield was never what it seemed, and the victory was never theirs alone. And once you understand that, the next moment in this story starts to make a lot more sense. By this point, you might think you understand these men, their strength, their courage, their ability to stand. when others couldn't. But none of that fully explains who they were. Because there's a moment in this story that reveals something deeper, something you don't see in battle, something you don't see in combat. You only see it in the quiet, in a moment when no one is expecting anything. One night, David said something. Not loudly, not publicly, not as a command, not as an order. There was no urgency, no pressure, just a thought, a simple human desire. Oh, that someone would give me water. Water, not strategy, not victory. Water, from a specific place, a well, located deep inside enemy territory, not nearby, not accessible, not safe. This wasn't a place you casually walked into. This was a place controlled by the enemy, a place guarded, watched, protected, a place that represented danger. And David knew that, which is why he didn't command anyone to go. He didn't ask. He didn't expect a response, because any man who attempted that would be risking his life for water. So he let the thought fade into the night, and in his mind, that was the end of it. But it wasn't, because 3 men heard it, not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Jashobim, Eleazar, and Shammah. The same 3 men who had already faced impossible battles, the same 3 men who had already proven they were different. And in that moment, something happened, not spoken, not discussed, but understood. Because sometimes loyalty doesn't need instructions. It recognizes need without being told. And this is where the story changes. Because what they were about to do was not logical. It was not strategic. It was not necessary. There was no reward, no recognition, no benefit. Just risk, just danger, just a decision. And the decision was this: if our leader desires something, we will get it, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter what stands in the way. And that kind of thinking is rare, because most people only move when they are told. Most people only act when there is something to gain. Most people calculate risk before they commit. But these men did something different. They moved without being asked. And that tells you something, not just about their strength, but about their loyalty. Because true loyalty is revealed in moments like this, not when it's convenient, not when it's easy, but when it costs something. And what this was going to cost was everything. Because where they were going was not safe. It was enemy territory, and not just near it, deep inside it, which means they would have to go through the enemy, not once, but twice, to get in and to get out. Imagine the scene. Night, darkness covering the land. The air is still, but beneath that stillness, there is tension. Because somewhere in that darkness, an enemy camp is awake. Guards posted, weapons ready, watching. And into that space, 3 men move. Not loudly, not carelessly, but intentionally. Jashobim, Eleazar, Shammah. 3 men walking toward danger, not away from it. And at this point, there is no turning back. Because once they step in, they are committed. And then it happens. Contact. They break through enemy lines, not by accident, but by force. The silence breaks. Shouts, movement, chaos. The enemy realizes something is wrong. And now it's not just infiltration. It's a fight. Again, 3 men against many. But this time, it's different. Because they are not there to win a battle. They are there for one thing: water. And that makes this even more dangerous. Because now, they are not just fighting to survive. They are fighting to complete a mission. And that means they cannot stop. They push forward, through resistance, through pressure, through opposition, until they reach it. The well, the source, the reason they came. And in the middle of enemy territory, and as surrounded by danger, they draw water. Think about how absurd that is. In the middle of a battlefield, they stop to collect water, not to drink it, but to carry it back. And now comes the hardest part, leaving, because getting in was only half the battle. Now they have to go back, through everything they just faced, again, with no guarantee they will make it. But they move, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the same intensity, fighting their way out, step by step, strike by strike, until finally they break through, they escape, they survive. And they return to David, holding water, from a place no one should have gone. All because of a thought, a simple desire, not for survival, not for recognition, but for loyalty. And this is where the story becomes powerful, because this wasn't about water. It never was. It was about what these men were willing to do, for someone they believed in. It was about commitment, without conditions. It was about action, without instruction. It was about loyalty, at a level most people will never reach, because loyalty like this doesn't come from convenience. It comes from conviction. And that kind of conviction is rare, extremely rare, because most people will not walk into danger for something that doesn't directly benefit them. Most people will not risk their lives for someone else's desire. Most people will not move unless they are told. But these men did, and that tells you something, not just about them, but about what they valued. Because when loyalty reaches that level, it changes everything. It changes relationships. It changes outcomes. It changes what is possible. And when you see that, you begin to understand something deeper. These weren't just warriors. They were men who could be trusted. See, men who could be relied on. Men who could stand, not just in battle, but in life. And when you find people like that, you don't take them for granted, because they are rare. And if you don't have them, then the real question becomes, who is standing with you? And when your moment comes, will they run or will they stand? At this point, something becomes clear. Not obvious at first, not loud, but undeniable. These men did not fight like normal people. They didn't respond the way most people would. They didn't retreat when retreat made sense. They didn't hesitate when hesitation would have been expected. They didn't break when everything around them said they should. And that forces a question, not about them, about us. Because if we're being honest, most people don't operate like this. Most people feel pressure and step back. They feel resistance and slow down. They feel fear and adjust. That's normal. That's human. That's how we're wired. To survive, to protect ourselves, to avoid unnecessary risk. And there's nothing wrong with that. But these men operated differently. They stepped forward when others stepped back. They continued when others stopped. They held their ground when others left. And when you look closely, you start to see why. Because they weren't just reacting to the situation. They were operating from a belief so strong, it changed how they saw everything. They fought like death was not the end. Let that sit for a moment, because that idea is uncomfortable. It challenges something deep inside us, because most decisions people make are influenced by one thing: fear. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of failure, and at the deepest level, fear of death. That fear shapes behavior. It determines how far people go, how much they risk, how long they stay. It sets boundaries, invisible boundaries that most people never cross, because crossing them feels dangerous. But what happens when that fear loses its power? What happens when a person reaches a point where death is no longer the ultimate threat? Everything changes completely, because now the thing that used to control decisions no longer has the same influence. The hesitation disappears. The second guessing fades. The constant calculation of risk becomes less important, and in its place, something else emerges. Clarity, focus, conviction. Because now the question is no longer, what happens if I lose? The question becomes, what am I willing to stand for? And that shift is powerful, because when a person reaches that point, they become extremely difficult to stop. Not because they are stronger, not because they are faster, but because they are no longer controlled by the same limits as everyone else. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because this is not just about ancient warriors, this is about people, now, today. Because the same pattern still exists. There are people who step back when things get difficult, and there are people who step forward. There are people who fold under pressure, and there are people who hold their ground. And the difference between them is not always ability. It's belief. What they believe about themselves, what they believe about their situation, and most importantly, what they believe about what comes next. Because belief determines behavior, and behavior determines outcome. If you believe something is the end, you act one way. If you believe it's not, you act another way. And that difference can completely change the result. Now think about these men again. Jashobeam, facing hundreds. Eleazar, standing alone. Shammah, defending his ground. In every situation, they were pushed to a point where most people would stop, but they didn't, because something inside them was stronger than the pressure around them, something that told them, keep going, something that allowed them to stand when everything else said to move. And that something was not physical, it was internal, it was belief. And belief is powerful, because it doesn't just affect what you think, it affects what you do, and what you do shapes what happens next. So now the question becomes personal, not about them, about you. When pressure shows up in your life, what do you do? When things become uncertain, how do you respond? When fear appears, what direction do you move? Do you step back or do you step forward? Because in that moment, you reveal something, not to others, to yourself. And that revelation matters, because it tells you where your limits are, and whether those limits are real or just accepted. Because here's the truth. Limits are not always physical. Most of the time, they're mental. They're based on what we believe we can handle, what we believe we can survive, what we believe is possible. And when those beliefs change, the limits change with them. That's what you're seeing in this story. Not just men fighting, but men operating beyond normal limits. And that only happens when something inside them has shifted, when fear loses control. And when fear loses control, limits begin to disappear. Not completely, but enough to change the outcome, enough to make the impossible possible. So maybe the real question is not how strong these men were or how skilled they were. Maybe the real question is this: what would your life look like if fear stopped controlling your decisions? And how much of what you call impossible is actually just something you've never stepped into? Because once you see that, you can't unsee it. At this point, this stops being just a story, and it becomes a mirror, because whether people admit it or not, everyone is fighting something. Not always on a battlefield, but in life. Pressure, responsibility, uncertainty, moments where everything feels like it's closing in. And in those moments, who stands with you matters. Because here's what's easy to miss in this story. David was a great leader, but even he needed men. Men who were strong, men who were loyal, men who didn't run when things got hard. And the truth is, most people don't have that. They have people around them, but not people who can stand with them. Because there's a difference between people who are around you when things are easy and people who stay when everything gets difficult. The men around David weren't just warriors. They were men of capacity, men who could handle pressure, men who could act without being told, men who were willing to risk something for someone else. And that kind of person is rare. But here's the uncomfortable part. You don't attract those kinds of people by accident. You build them. You become one. Because strong people are drawn to strength, loyalty is drawn to loyalty, and capacity recognizes capacity. So the real question is, who are the people around you? And more importantly, what kind of person are you becoming? Because in life, there will be moments where everything feels like it's falling apart. And in those moments, you will find out very quickly who can actually stand and who cannot. And if no one can stand with you, then maybe the work isn't just finding better people. Maybe it's becoming better and building better. Because in the end, this story was never just about war. It was about what happens when fear no longer controls a man, and what happens when the right people stand beside him. Because if fear disappears, limits disappear with it, and if the right people are around you, even impossible battles start to look different. So maybe the real question isn't what these men did. Maybe the real question is this: when your moment comes, will you have men who can stand with you, or will you be standing alone? If this made you think differently, share this video with someone. Share it with your family and friends, because most people will never understand this level of faith. Kindly like, comment below, and subscribe to this channel. Turn on post notifications, so when I post a new video, you will be the first to be notified. I will see you in the next video. Good night, and God bless you.